Among the more interesting dynamics in intergenerational abuse cycles is the fact that someone who has been abused, molested, incestuously, beaten, is far more likely to abuse their child or another innocent, vulnerable person than someone who has not experienced that pain and abuse. Now, on first glance, you might think, well, you know how painful it is. You know how devastating it is. You know exactly how it feels like and how wrong it is to be abused by a power figure. So why would you do that to your child? And it's a good question. And I want to outline how this intersects with identity and the transition between the empathic and the reptilian brain. So, an empathic person empathizes with the victim, with the child, with the smaller one, with the feminine part in a conflict, in an abuse dynamic. A healthy empathic person, if they see a child being beaten by someone 3 times their size, 3 times older than them, protects the child, protects the vulnerable one. An empathic person says women and children first. An empathic person, seeing a single person being attacked by a gang, goes to the defense of the single person. We're dealing with a human being. And what defines our humanity, what differentiates us from a tiger or a reptile, is that when the tiger or the crocodile is on the hunt, is in a predatory mode, the tiger will attack the child, the weak, the sick, because when a herd of gazelles is running, it is the sick, it is the old, it is the weak, it is the young that are most likely to fall behind. A newly born foal, shortly out of the womb, is not going to be able to keep up with the herd if a predatory animal launches an attack on the herd at that time. The herd takes flight, and who's going to be at the rear? Who's going to be running slower than the rest? The elderly, the sick, the one with the bad eyesight. And the predator does not distinguish from a place of empathy or morality or even wisdom. You know, a healthy Native American tribe in traditional days would leave a pregnant woman or a pregnant mother alone, would not attack the salmon that was going upstream to lay eggs. because it's destructive to the ecology, and also from a sense of empathy, a sense of understanding the abundance cycle of the ecology. Let the young be born, let the young grow up to be healthy. And if there needs to be a competition for survival, compete with the warriors. The nobility in war dictated the same thing. That if you wanted to test your mettle, and in some of the original derivations of compete, the Latin for compete, to draw out what is best in the other. If you want to learn a good tennis game, you can't improve your game playing with a sloppy opponent. You will actually deteriorate your game. And so one of the drives, one of the aspirations, if you think about that archetypal energy of wanting to be a knight or wanting to be a hero, wanting to be a warrior, it wasn't to drop napalm on women and children from a helicopter. One doesn't have to aspire to be great in such a battle. It's not a noble or ennobling form of combat to sit in a bunker with a remote control and blow up apartment complexes halfway around the world with a drone, because there might have been a terrorist agent or a suspected agent. And sure, women and children have been blown up to the tune of 90% plus innocent bystanders and casualties. There's nothing noble or ennobling about it. But this is how a crocodile thinks. If a crocodile is going along the river and sees a couple and a 5-year-old child walking a little bit behind, the crocodile algorithm calculates small child, better chance of success, lower chance of skill, lower chance of being armed, easier prey. And the crocodile will attack the 5-year-old. Because from a purely sociopathic lens, this is strategic. An Ivan Boesky or a Michael Milken in the paradigm of the 1980s corporate raiders doesn't try and buy up and split up and fire tens of thousands of workers in a very robust market with a company at its best. A corporate raider functions as a crocodile. It perceives a weak point in the stock price, and more importantly, it perceives the possibility to dominate, and goes in with the idea that we're going to buy the shares for less than the total underlying assets. We're going to fire all the people. We're going to destroy a company, and we'll sell off the assets for more money than it took to buy the shares. And that's predatory thinking. A loan shark doesn't go to a wealthy person with lots of money and say, give me 30% interest a week and I'll be back on Friday. Because a healthy, wealthy individual tells them to fuck off. Take your predatory practices elsewhere. I'll get a loan from a good bank for 4%, for 8% a year. So who agrees to these predatory lenders? A pregnant mother who wants to be in the hospital or wants to be able to afford a midwife and can't get the money, but hopes things will turn out well. So there's a distinction between the reptilian brain and the empathic brain. The human part of psychology is the exact opposite of the reptilian part of psychology. The human part says, pick on someone your own size. That's not a fair fight. There's still combat. There's still competition within that psychology, but it's a psychology that roots for the underdog naturally and that looks for a fair fight. It's the basis of the free market system. It's the basis upon which Standard Oil was broken up. Was Rockefeller had secret deals with the railways, worked constantly to try and squeeze out. There was a pipeline that was trying to compete with the Rockefeller pipeline. So they figured out where the pipeline was going to run that would be their competition. And they kept buying up a few parcels simply to sabotage the competition because they didn't want a fair fight. The monopolist, your tired, incompetent, rude building official at the local building department, whose last concern is getting your building permit to you on time or helping you avoid mistakes, is not worrying constantly about how they can do a better job because they've got a monopoly position. Who else wants to work in such a bureaucratic nightmare as most governments are, except someone who enjoys passing on the misery they experience in public service, quote unquote, to the public who has to pay for it. And the same tired and irritable official that will send you from one department to the other just to make sure that they don't have to do an ounce of extra work even though they're being paid hourly, will fret and have a tantrum if you suggest, how about deregulating this office and letting anyone process the permits, and all your fed-up customers can get their permits quickly approved in 3 or 4 days for far less money and much more courtesy for half the fees. No. We have to hold on to our power and then harass the public. So monopolies, picking on the small guy, beating the child, kicking the dog because you can't kick the boss preying on the employees preying on their spouses preying on their children, the children preying on the dog. We're looking at a stream of abuse, of violation that's all predatory. It's all coming from the reptilian brain out of fear. There's no real dignity about it. And the dignity of a knight, of a samurai warrior, of the mythological framework of Arthur and the knights. It was about fair play. It was the joy of being beaten by someone better than you and learning in the process to be able to internalize these dynamics where your weakness could be informed. And in most cases, in this more noble thing, you fought well. It was an honor to fight with you. And you have this in the best aspects of, the Olympics and the tradition of shaking hands. We're dealing with a paradigm of where competition, still present, is about the opportunity to become more. And it's about respect for an opponent that brings out the best in you. Obviously, this is not what we're talking about in childhood abuse. It's discharging energy on the most vulnerable people who can't take the abuse. So there's the difference. Now, why is it that so many victims of sociopathic abuse turn around and do the same thing to someone else? Well, one of the things to look at is identity. And it's important to understand, kind of as an adjunct to identity, that most people cling to their identity, sometimes more than they cling to their own life. When you look at a suicide bomber or a country that will just drive itself into the ground following a dogma, whether that's communism or capitalism, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, whether it's this fanatic or this fanatic, whether it's this religion or this religion. If you look closely at the wars of identity, you will find that the dominant identity in the culture, traditionally, in a very reptilian fashion, preys upon the minority. You can find Adolf Hitler preying on the minority of the Jewish people, but you could find the exact same thing going on in the United States. Obviously not with gas chambers, but with university discrimination, with discrimination in jobs, with all kinds of censure, of punishment, because you're different than us and you're a minority. You find it with the minority. Throughout human history, a minority of people have been homosexual. Bi, queer, lesbian, homosexual. A minority of people. We saw it with the Greeks, and we've seen it in every culture since. A minority of people have diverged from sexual norms. And in a majority of cultures, they have been punished because they're messing with identity. Now, this attachment to identity is deeply fundamental to cult psychology, to the politics of identity. And you have to wonder what it is exactly about someone calling God Buddha or Jesus or Muhammad, what's so threatening about these names? Or someone wearing a black scarf or a red dress or a white robe. Are these things really so upsetting? Or wearing interesting hats? Or what's the big deal? Doesn't this create diversity? You go to a food market. Do you want to eat potatoes every single day? Cooked in the same way? No matter what it is. The beauty of a flower market is all the varieties of flowers. The beauty of a cosmopolitan culture, all the different types of thinking and feeling and believing and dressing and eating. And the beauty of a international food court is a little bit of, how interesting, and this, and I'll put this together. The spice of life. And yet, traditionally, minorities of all kinds have been persecuted for no other reason when it boils down to it, other than one, they are different, and two, they are small enough to be attacked without the majority minding. And the only reason a majority is not minding is because they're different, meaning we don't identify with them. We identify with us. Now, you take homosexuality, for example, in an overpopulated planet with huge ecological crises. And you could say, thank you so much for being different. We really could use a little break from so many people on the planet right at this time. Let's have more homosexuals for 100 years. And then, if the population gets too low to maintain culture, etc., then let's work with it. But in other words, a minority that is being persecuted is often superior in technical areas than the majority. In fact, this is always the case, even within majority identities of race and all of that. A distinct minority is always superior at something. And yet, their superiority is downplayed, and their difference, and more importantly, the fear of that difference is overplayed. So what's going on there? Well, when something is different, and with Singapore, one of the things that was institutionalized was that as the government took over responsibility for housing the people, they studied different groups and stuff around the world, and what they saw is that if you leave people to their own devices, they group around race and other forms of ethnic identity. They become clan-like. All the Italians group over here, all the Japanese group over here. They group, the wealthy people all live in this neighborhood, the poor people all live here, and they all bifurcate. And then having bifurcated, they hang out with their own group. They become highly identified with a specific group, not with a people. And then they begin treating another group poorly after villainizing them on the basis of their being different. The evil rich people, the lazy poor people, the addicted homeless people, whatever it is, that people want instinctively to be with people who are like them. They then proceed to stereotype other groups. And then they behave hostilely to groups other than themselves. And so in Singapore, they eradicated this particular fear-based trait by grouping people so that in any group of housing, like in a single building, there would be one wealthy person, one medium person, and one poor person, and they'd all be together. And they did this by size of building and penthouse and this, so that they actually engineered homogeneity, that all the races and all the different sects had to be living in close proximity. And as a result, they all understood each other very well. They identified with the country rather than their little clique. And this was incredibly good for Singapore as a culture. But it wasn't human nature. It was engineered. Now, the same is true with African American and Caucasian Americans, that mixing the schools had to be done in some way by mandate and law, because there were too many white people hating too many black people and too many black people hating and fearing too many white people, and they weren't spending time together. The more you spend time getting to know the people of your political opposition, etc., the more empathy there is. But what's driving this polarization? And it's the discomfort with the unknown, which, when acted on, when you're uncomfortable with the unknown, you hang around your type. And when you hang around your type, the unknown gets bigger because you're a little bit more comfortable with people like you. And so you spend all your time with people like you. Now you know nothing about the people who are not like you. And you become frightened. As they become more unknown, your fear of them goes up. And your identity with them goes down. You don't identify with them as people. You disidentify with them on all kinds of different relatively arbitrary metrics. And it is puzzling because a kind white person is far more enjoyable to spend time with than a sociopathic black person. And a sociopathic white person is much less enjoyable to spend time with than a warm and empathic black person. A trustworthy and friendly Catholic is more enjoyable than a radical jihadist Muslim, and vice versa. Meaning it's the person that has the most impact. But it's the clan, it's the cult, it's the label that the mind pays the most attention to in a paradigm of fear of the unknown. Now, where does this fear of the unknown come from? Well, one of the sources of the fear of the unknown is trauma. The more traumatized one is, the more frightened one is of the unknown. Why? Well, the more traumatized one is, the more frightened one is of pain. The more traumatized you are, the more pain you're in. And nobody picks trauma. Nobody sets out and says, I think I'd like to be traumatized and I'd like you to traumatize me. The very core of trauma is something overwhelming and out of your control. Well, if you want to avoid being overwhelmed not understanding something and not having anything in your control. Are you going to pick a group or a situation that you're very familiar with and you know? Or are you going to pick a new situation, an unknown, that anything could happen? If you're afraid of being out of control, if you're afraid of helplessness, if you're afraid of abuse and you're afraid of pain, it's normal to gravitate towards repetitive and habitual situations where you feel in control. The more traumatized a person, you'll find this with severely traumatized people, they won't leave the house. Because only in their house do they feel completely in control. The walls are not going to suddenly change color. The rooms stay just where they are. So that tremendous anxiety and panic around the unknown is reassured. I'm in control, I'm in control. Someone knocks on the door, though, and you're in a traumatized state. Who is it? It produces anxiety. The telephone rings. Who is it? Who's trying to call me? I'm not in control of that. Another radio station, another personality, another point of view. I want my point of view. In other words, highly traumatized cultures segment by race, by economic status, by various identities. And then they habituate and perpetuate those specific habits and identities. And they feel frightened of anything different. And in their fear, they feel hatred, they feel hostility. Why? Because you're scaring me. How? By being different, by widening the possibility field. Now, only highly traumatized groups are frightened of strangers, frightened of the unknown, hate anything that's different. Why is that? Well, the unknown is neutral. It's a very sad statistic in its correlation with irrational behavior, but most sexual abuse, most physical abuse, most psychological abuse is perpetrated by spouses, family members, teachers, and clergy in your group. Meaning, if you're afraid of rape and molestation and lies and cheating and embezzlement, get out of your family. Go to another culture. Because statistically speaking, you're more likely to be abused by someone closer to you than a stranger. Most kidnappings, most rapes, most incests, you name it, they're in your own group. So a rational point of view would be you're frightened of pain and abuse, get the hell out of wherever you're at and go meet some strangers. But that's not what we do, because what we're really afraid of is the unknown. Because if you're afraid of pain and you don't know how to deal with it, if you're afraid of trauma and you don't know how to deal with it, and why would you? Because we're emotionally illiterate in many cases. You won't receive a single formal scientific hour studying the chemistry and art of feeling and what feelings are produced by this and that anywhere in your cult. So we cling to the familiar to manage our fears of the unknown. We're afraid of the unknown because we're afraid of being helpless and out of control, and we're not in control when we venture into the unknown. If we are in control, it's not really the unknown, is it? You know, you can go into a new neighborhood, but the streets are all still the same. The unknown is, by definition, mysterious. You know, when I traveled around the world, there are all kinds of things I didn't understand. And I didn't know that I didn't know until I took the time to find out. And they could have been worse, and they could have been better. And this gets into the scientific reality of the unknown. The unknown is as likely to be better than the status quo as worse. Meaning, the way the possibility field bifurcates, if you look at a possibility field and where you stand upon that possibility field, to the right of you is everything that gets better from where you are, and to the left of you is everything that gets worse. And they both go out equally and infinitely. Things can get infinitely better. We may lack the imagination to figure it out, and things can get infinitely worse, and we're right in the middle. When you go into the unknown, they could be better or they could be worse. Well, that's 50-50 odds of better or worse, and it's 100% odds of growth and being interesting. So who doesn't want to grow and have more interesting stuff going on in their life? Someone who's terrified of the unknown. Who's terrified of the unknown? Someone who's been severely traumatized when they ventured out into the unknown, they ventured out of the womb and were immediately traumatized by their parents, traumatized by the hospital staff. They left the womb and the doctors are shining blinding lights in them and cutting off the tip of their penis and who knows what else. It's like, we don't want to do that again. This is terrifying. You know, let's find some nice little comfortable thing and stay there. So, what's this inflection point where a person who is a human being starts to become reptilian? Where a human moves from empathizing with the child to preying on the child. Well, it takes scarcity, which leads to pain, which leads to fear of pain. And at some point, the fear of pain, in the context of scarcity, becomes so intense it overloads the empathic circuits of the brain. You've probably watched those horror movies from time to time where some cute little blonde 6-year-old girl, it's a shaking in the night, a growling of a beast or something, and this little girl says, "I think I'll go down into the cellar." And then they'll flash down to some horrible thing in the cellar, and then the little girl takes a step down. And at some point, it's like, let's just get it over with. I mean, this idiot is doomed. And it becomes too overwhelming to empathize with this helpless little girl. Like, just kill her. Just get it over with. Stop with the music. I don't want to live through that horror as a helpless child. Sometimes you get mad at the victim. You fucking moron. Why did you have to leave your car? What do you mean you go over there at 11 at night in the dark neighborhood? You deserve to be raped. But what's going on here is the human part of the brain that identifies and empathizes with the child, with the victim with the one surrounded by the gang, with the smaller army, with the company that's being raided, is that empathy gets too real and too painful, and it becomes overwhelming. I don't want my identification to be decimated. Now here trauma comes in again, because trauma destroys identity. If you're a healthy young man and you go off to Iraq and your best friend is blown up in front of your face, you watch yourself shoot a 10-year-old girl because she has a knapsack. The fear, the pain, the trauma, your identity is shot. You become a different person. You develop PTSD. You didn't want to become a different person. You weren't consulted. It just happened, and you were never the same. Now, this is a transcendent experience. All trauma is transcendent, but it's transcendent in the worst way possible. You felt completely and utterly unable to maintain your pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. It was ripped away from you by an external force. And now you barely feel like you can barely hold on to your sanity, to your thoughts, to your feelings. You've been raped psychologically, and you've lost your identity. And when your identity has been lost in trauma, you weren't prepared. It's not a voluntary thing. I mean, you see this wonderful kind of heroic thing where the lone knight, the noble father rushes in to save his daughter. The person consciously puts their child ahead of them and gets them on the boat, and they go to the gas chambers. These are voluntary transcendences. They're understood, and there's a strengthening involved, because I'm following my ideals. I'm making a sacrifice of my identity for something more important, the future, the generation, the child, the organization, my political candidate. I'm going to sacrifice something so that this ideal can go forward. That may be uncomfortable, but it's not the same trauma as just someone blowing up your wife in front of you. And suddenly you feel completely different, you think completely different, your body is in shock, you've lost your identity. When you're in that dissociative lost identity place, we need an identity. We need a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. We need a pattern. We need an identity. We've lost it. And so we look around for something, and we look for something that is solid to antidote the helplessness, to antidote the sense that it could be ripped away at any moment. And negative states are more solid than positive states. If you're feeling in a high state of joy, it's pretty easy to knock you off of that most of the time. You feel really joyful and happy. What if I shoot your wife? You still feel joyful and happy? No, you feel pain, you feel miserable, you feel angry. But if you feel angry and pain and miserable, and I shoot your wife, you still feel angry, pain, and misery. In other words, it's a pretty stable identity. If I'm looking for certainty, pain and fear in a sociopathic environment is far more certain. Because even if something wonderful happens that day, you can hold on to your fear-based identity and say, well, it'll be worse tomorrow. So I'm not giving up my fear. I'll just wait until the next fearful thing happens. You've got something solid. So many people who are traumatized abusively identify with the trauma because it's the most solid thing in their life, because traumatic memories are the most intense memories you're ever going to have. You can relive them, iota by iota in technicolor, technosound. Again, so you know who you are because you're identifying with the most intense memory of your life, which just happens to be the most painful. So a traumatic event happens, you lose your identity, you grasp desperately for an identity, a coherent pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. And I grasp onto the traumatized identity because it's so available, it's so intense, and it's so available. So now I identify with the trauma. I have a new identity. It just happens to be the most painful identity that I can possibly find. Well, what if that trauma is the identity of being abused? And as you hold on to the abuse, it gets too painful. It gets overwhelming. The helplessness of waiting to be predated upon again and again, waiting for the same angry gang of boys to bully you on your way to school every single day. It's like there's nothing I can do. They're faster than me. There's 5 of them. They're never going to get caught, and I will be humiliated at home if I talk about it. So one of the things that goes on is an idealization of power, meaning when you feel powerless, the thing you want more than anything is to feel powerful. Well, who's powerful in your world? The bully is. I'm the victim. I feel powerless. I would give anything to feel less powerful. Who's my role model? The bully. See, the bully is enjoying their sense of power as I feel helpless. And so one of the drives is idealization of dominance, of strength, of the bully. Another drive is the pull towards certainty, because my identity as a happy child is being raped and ripped away from me by the bully. But their identity as a bully is being strengthened by my rape. Meaning every single day, the 5 assholes gang up on me, the little boy. Their identity goes away stronger because they won again. Their identity came out on top. My identity was ripped away again. The more it gets ripped away, the more I want certainty. The more helpless I feel, the more strong I want to feel. And my role model for reliable strength and strengthened identity and coming out on top is the perpetrator. They have more impact on me than anyone else in my life. No one's protecting me, or you wouldn't have been perpetrated in the first place. You see, if adults are doing their job, they don't raise bullies, and they protect small children from bullies. So the adults are not doing their job, which is why bullies become bullies, because you have to follow the abuse pattern that leads to an innocent child becoming a bully. And then you have to follow the abuse pattern that leads to the bully being set loose and unsupervised and unhealed. And then you have to follow the abuse pattern that sees innocent children. I mean, you've got complete psychological and sociopathic levels of illiteracy there. Meaning anyone who can read character says, you have a cruel streak, and it comes from your father, and it comes from your wife's mother, or your mother's aunt. And you've been given that in various ways in your household, and you are now cruel and sadistic to the helpless in the way that they are at times towards you and that you can't do anything about. So you're passing on a virus given to you by your family. You're passing on a virus given, it could be in the hospitals. You're desperately trying to bond with something. There's all these, brilliant lights going on, and you're being carted away and separated, and no matter how much you scream, nobody listens to you. You feel completely and utterly helpless. And then everyone says you had a wonderful childhood, but that's not how your body feels. Maybe you're trying to make someone else feel helpless just so you can figure out what helplessness is, because you feel it, but everyone's pretending it's not there because you're surrounded by psychologically illiterate people who can't empathize, who can't imagine what it might be like to be 1 week old in a hospital, or 1 month old with a 13-year-old schizophrenic babysitter, or whatever it is. So there's no comprehension. And so you're alone and helpless. But the bully seems to be stronger than you are. So you've got the draw of your ideal, which is strength. You've got the exposure to a strong energy that affects you, often more than school and more than your parents, because intense trauma has impact is gauged by intensity of emotion. It's more than just time. If you're bored and sit through school for 8 hours a day bored, but then a bully terrifies you into an exquisite state of panic for 10 minutes a day, what is your body going to remember more? The 10 minutes a day of panic or the 8 hours a day of boredom? You are defined by your most intense experiences. So you're being defined by the bully and by the sociopathic culture that put you together unprotected. First, the sociopathic culture created the bully, then it set them loose, then nobody saw and addressed the issue. All of that is sociopathic. It's all psychological illiterate. It's all predictable. One competent person in that circle could do something about that if they were listened to. But in a reptilian family, if one empathic person says, "You have brought up a sadistic child," you need to apologize to them and go back into some of those events and recreate a scenario where that innocence is not destroyed. Well, in a reptilian family, the guy gets out a gun and says, "Who are you to tell me how to raise my child? I'm a fucking reptile. I fucked up my son, and now I'm going to fuck up you for talking and defending him." Well, there's a good reptilian cult for you. So that's in play. And then anyone who's grown up in this cult understands what sensitive and vulnerable children are going to go through. And they also understand the phenomena, because it plays out every day, that the bully picks on the very weakest person they can possibly find. Because the bully isn't looking to compete or bring out the best or have a clean fight. The bully is looking to terrorize their victim. So you're an onlooker, and you're a human being, and you're watching an innocent child be raped, and you're going to watch them be raped again, and you're going to watch them be raped again. And at first you feel horrified. At first you feel empathy. But the more you love and empathize with what is being brutalized, the more pain you're in. You're now afraid of pain. So you're afraid of your caring for another human being. And so you've got to cut off that care, because the pain level is so high that your empathic brain is overloading and shutting down. Meaning there is a pain threshold beyond which a person can go. Meaning if you just keep turning up the pain, at some point you're going to say, "Stop the feeling. I don't care what I have to do. This is too painful. Shut the program down. And that's called dissociation. At that pain point of dissociation where you shut feelings down, you dissociate from the abuse. And you enter your reptilian brain. The reptilian brain is not burdened by complex feelings. It's given a survival mandate with fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. Ass lick, if that works. Freeze, if that works. Run, if that works. Fight, if that works. There's no empathy or feelings. It's just survival. Now, the reptilian brain is designed to survive reptilian sociopathic environments. So if you are in the reptilian brain, your body has been exposed to a set of stimuli that it considers to be sociopathic and reptilian. Therefore, your reptilian brain kicked in to keep you alive in a sociopathic and reptilian environment. So here you are. Now, that's just the way that goes. It's sad to the empathic brain, but at a certain point it becomes too sad, too painful, too terrifying, and you just go numb. You dissociate, you go off. Now, you now no longer empathize. Now, but there's a mid-ground that often happens at this point, which is the disidentification with the victim and the identification of the abuser. In other words, it may be terrifying and painful to imagine being the victim, but it may be empowering to imagine being the bully. So we dissociate from the victim and we imagine being the bully. We imagine being the alpha. We imagine being at the top of the dominance hierarchy, and we imagine the enjoyment of inflicting pain on other people. And really, it's the enjoyment of control. It's the enjoyment of safety. It's the enjoyment of winning. It's the enjoyment of certainty. Because if you're 5 times the size of your victim, the outcome is pretty darn certain. That's why you picked someone 5 times smaller than you. You're looking for certainty. And in a chaotic, traumatic world, everyone is looking for certainty. Do you find it identifying with someone that has a 90% chance of losing their identity and becoming traumatized? Or do you find it with someone who's going to beat the shit out of that little boy and win? You find it with the victor. So there's a whole strain of psychology where basically it's not about empathy at all. It's survival, reptilian thinking that just says, who's going to win? I'm being with them. Meaning if I'm insecure and lack self-esteem, I want to be liked by the cool kids because they'll protect me from my fears of inadequacy and insecurity. Now, in reptilian high school, etc., usually the cool kids are in conflict with the dwerbs, the less cool kids. And often the price of joining the gang is to cast all the shame that you're feeling inside onto other people through dissociation. You can no longer associate with the uncool parts of yourself. You have to pretend you're totally cool. And then you can no longer associate with anyone in the unpopular group, who are often healthier as human beings than the cool ones. Even the word cool is interesting because on the empathic sociopathic continuum, numb, cold, ice cold is much closer to cool than warmth, love, and empathy. So to be cool is defined in the teenage ideal. I don't care. Meaning, I'm now a teenager who no longer cares about your feelings and who no longer has feelings of my own. I'm numb. I'm dissociated. I'm cool. And in a traumatized, pain-based cult, cool is all you can hope for. It's like, we're not talking about sanity. We're not talking about love. We're not talking about fun. We're not talking about empathy. All we're talking about is going from feeling in tremendous pain and helpless to being numb to all that pain and feeling more in control. That's called being cool. Now, and then that's idealized by a teenager because most teenagers are the exact opposite. They're a complete emotional basket case of unregulated feelings in an emotionally illiterate culture. And to go to being numb and at least appearing not to care is heaven for a teenager. They can become a reptile. So one does not want to identify with the people being shamed and cast out. One wants to identify with the winner, with the reptile, with the ones who are cool. As a child being molested, the pain, the dissociation, the overwhelm of sensation, it's just so big. I can't feel what it's like to be me. It's too painful. But I can look into the eyes of my abuser, who's 3 times my size, who's grunting away, whose identity is being strengthened because they're identifying as a pedophile, and by becoming sexually aggressive towards a child, that identity is getting stronger, meaning whatever you identify with, every time you do it successfully, your identity gets stronger. If I identify with being a thief and I never can manage to steal something, my identity feels pretty helpless. If I identify as a thief and I'm always successful at stealing something, my identity is strong and my survival and security needs are taken care of. And in a cult like ours, maybe your sense of sex as a substitute for love and belonging is taken care of as well, with someone else who is reptilian, who just wants safety and security and will happily bed up with a thief who is a successful thief, but will attack a thief who can't steal enough to support the family. We're dealing with reptilian brain, dealing with survival and security. So one can identify with the perpetrator as a way of escaping the helplessness of one's own identity as a victim. Once that takes place, in order to escape the helplessness I felt as a victim, I imagined what it was like to rape me. I looked at the strength in my father. I did this, I did that. And I want to be like that. And I identify. I'm not the helpless child being raped. I am the dominant guy who's doing the raping. Well, this medicates and answers a tremendous amount of the need. And it is what everyone does at the point where the pain gets so high. You can find it even at that it's unbearable. You can find it even at to that point where if your feminine side has been raped, abused, trashed, humiliated, never had a chance to grow, and it just feels completely shame-based and helpless, like the feminine side in so many of our men in a chauvinistic cult. When you try and identify with your feminine side, you feel hurt, you feel small, you feel unlovable, you feel valueless in a cult that does not value your feminine side. So you disintegrate, you dissociate from your own feminine side. And what do? You identify with the machismo of the masculine side, who defines itself with its contempt and superiority towards the feminine. Well, how do you strengthen that identity? By abusing feminine men and feminine women. It's one of the reasons why so many homosexual men are abused around the world, is that the machismo of chauvinism is not so much about women as it is around femininity. And so if you're going to express femininity as a man and also confuse me about my masculine identity, I'm going to just beat the shit out of you. I'm going to hate you because you're shaking my identity in a psychological environment in which I'm terrified of the unknown. In summary, a healthy human being will identify and protect women and children first, the small one before the big one, the little guy, the scapegoat, the bullied child, you name it. There will be empathy towards the one who needs the most help. As the odds of helping them go down, as the odds of losing the fight to protect the innocent goes down, the pain goes up, the fear, the anxiety, and the helplessness goes up. As that continues to go up, it reaches a certain point where it becomes too devastatingly painful and helpless to identify and care for the victim, inside and out. At that moment, there is a dissociation from the part of ourself and the part of the other that is being violated, and an association with the rage, the hate, and the fear of the perpetrator. That's where you see the hostility. They shouldn't have left their door open, you fucking moron. Of course he walked all over you. You walked into it. What's the anger there that is being, that is just used to just trash people in traumatized states of horror? It's the terror of feeling the same part in ourselves that can't stand up to the bully. We are so terrified of the part of us that will give in, that will allow abuse, that will participate in something unhealthy, that won't protect us, that couldn't escape. And there's so much hatred and contempt for that part of ourselves because it's so painful to be in that moment when the abuse took place. And that then gets externalized and projected onto the victim out there. And you find an environment where the clever thief is somehow admired, where the sociopathic reptile who steals a woman's virginity by lying and playing a game is admired, where the con artist who got away with it is admired like they're a winner, which is something the scared small part in every person wants to be. You know, where you watch a bank robbery movie where the bank robber is cool and rich and outsmarts the police, and it's like, yes, I like it. I'm looking for that. And I don't really care if it's right or wrong or violent or this or criminal, or I want to win, and I identify with that winning. Well, when you pick on little kids, you always win. When you rape little girls, you always win. When you rob a bank with a submachine gun, you win initially. And it's that seeking of control. So at that pain point, we dissociate from the victim, we associate with the abuser. We feel better as soon as that happens. And as long as it's too intimidating and frightening to go back and identify with the loser, the victim, the feminine in ourselves, it will be too frightening to go back to caring and identifying and fighting that in another. And as long as that happens, the virus of abuse is infected. The identity becomes our own. We identify with that habit of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. And you can see this in an interesting phenomena where sexual abuse survivors that are trying to be with the part of themselves that was hurt and felt so small will often get close to the pain and then suddenly flip and identify with the abuser, and then they'll cut themselves, they'll berate themselves verbally, they'll go out and be sexually raped again, deliberately, identifying with the abuser, or they'll watch violent porn, and they'll imagine being the perpetrator. And what this is basically saying is, I don't have a pain tolerance to stay in my empathic brain around this incident. Therefore, I'm identifying with the abuser, who's far more numb, and thus in far more, they're feeling far less pain. And they have far more control because every predatory abuser picks a victim that they can beat easily. You know, criminals, rapists, murderers, they'll say, that person was looked down and looked like they'd be an easy target, so I attacked them because they reminded me of a part of myself when I was attacked, when I felt worthless. And I hate that part of myself. I can't stand the fact that at 5 years old, after being repeatedly raped and traumatized and bullied and humiliated, that I just gave up and I let it happen. I hate that part of myself. And your walk tells me that you've just given up. I hate you. And I'm going to identify with the abuser and I'm going to attack you. And when I attack you, it dissociates me from my victim, the recipient of that same abuse, further. And it helps me build my identity stronger as the perpetrator to defend against that pain. And that's a coping mechanism. It's a pain management mechanism. At the inflection point, when the pain is too big, the empathic brain shuts down, the reptilian brain kicks in, and kicking in generally identifies with the perpetrator.